April 1945. Berlin is a city of gray ghosts and settled ash. The air is thick with a cloying metallic scent, a mixture of pulverized brick, cordite, and the sweet, sickening smell of decay that rises from the cellars where the living and the dead have shared the same dark space for weeks. The silence here is not the peaceful quiet of a country evening. It is a heavy, pressurized vacuum left in the wake of the most sustained bombardment in human history. Under the iron-gray sky, the once proud capital of the Third Reich has been reduced to a skeletal landscape of jagged walls and sightless windows. The people who remain move like shadows, their skin the color of the rubble they sift through, their eyes focused only on the next few inches of ground. The promise of a 1,000-year empire has ended in a 0 hour of absolute stillness. For 12 years, the German people were fed a steady diet of ideological iron. They were told they were the vanguard of a new world order, a race of supermen destined to inherit the earth through the sheer force of their will and the purity of their blood. Propaganda films showed them sun-drenched rallies and endless columns of invincible youth. But as the spring of 1945 arrived, the screen went dark. The context of this total collapse was not merely military. It was the total bankruptcy of a belief system. The civilians huddling in the ruins of the Wilhelmstrasse were not just losing a war, they were losing the very foundation of their reality. The ideology that had demanded their total sacrifice had vanished, leaving behind only the cold reality of a starving, broken land. The German civilian, particularly the women and the elderly who survived the final siege, lived in a state of sensory deprivation. The sound of a bell, the chime of a clock, or the ring of a telephone had long since been replaced by the rhythmic thud of artillery and the scream of diving aircraft. When the guns finally fell silent, the resulting quiet was terrifying. It was a void that emphasized their isolation. They had been told for years that the Americans were a soft, decadent people, a mongrel nation held together by nothing but greed and jazz music. The German populace expected a vengeful, chaotic mob of looters, a mirror image of the cruelty they had been told was the hallmark of their enemies. They waited behind their boarded-up doors for the sound of boots, expecting the end of their world. What they found instead was a contrast that defied their understanding of human nature. As the first American units rolled into the shattered districts, the sound that announced them was not the rhythmic, goose-stepping stomp of the Wehrmacht, but the casual, mechanical hum of the Jeep and the heavy rumble of the GMC truck. The soldiers sitting in these vehicles were not the gaunt, desperate men the Germans had seen retreating toward the heart of the Reich. These men were tall, broad-shouldered, and possessed a physical vitality that seemed impossible in a world defined by rationing and scarcity. They moved with a relaxed, almost nonchalant confidence that was more intimidating than any parade ground discipline. The symbolic weight of this arrival began with the smallest of gestures. A soldier leaning against a fender, casually peeling an orange. To a Berliner who had not seen fresh fruit in years, the bright citrus scent cutting through the smell of smoke was a revelation. It was the first hint of an abundance so vast it could afford to be careless. In these early days of the occupation, the German civilian watched from the shadows, their hearts hardened by fear and loss, unable to reconcile the image of the decadent American with the healthy, well-equipped reality before them. The silence of the rubble remained, but the air was beginning to vibrate with the energy of a power that did not need to shout to be heard. The vacuum was waiting to be filled. As the spring of 1945 deepened into a warm, surreal May, the physical reality of the American presence began to manifest as a force of nature rather than a mere occupying army. The German civilians, peering through the jagged apertures of bombed-out apartment blocks, witnessed a phenomenon that historical records would later quantify as the greatest logistical feat in the history of warfare. But to the mother sifting through the dust for a single unburnt potato, the statistics were irrelevant. What mattered was the sight of the giants. These were the American GIs, men who seemed to belong to a different species than the hollow-cheeked, gray-faced soldiers of the late-war Wehrmacht. They were tall, Their uniforms were made of thick, high-quality wool, and their skin possessed a glow of health that spoke of a lifetime of milk, meat, and vitamins. The contrast was a psychological blow that hit harder than the falling of the bombs. For a decade, Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine had characterized Americans as a disorganized, racially diluted mass, physically inferior to the Nordic ideal. Yet, here stood the evidence of the lie. The American soldier didn't just walk, he lounged. He moved with a terrifyingly casual ease, leaning against trucks that were filled to the brim with supplies. The German people watched as crates were pried open with crowbars, revealing not just ammunition, but white bread, canned peaches, cigarettes, and chocolate. The sheer waste of the Americans, the way they would discard a half-eaten K-ration or toss a cigarette but that still had several puffs left, sent a tremor of disbelief through the starving crowds. The logistics of American abundance became the first true ambassador of democracy. In the American sector of Berlin and across the southern zones of occupation, the roar of the Red Ball Express and the endless convoys created a new soundscape for the defeated nation. While the German rail system lay in twisted heaps of blackened steel, the Americans simply brought their own roads in the form of heavy engineering battalions and endless fleets of trucks. Factual records from the period indicate that by mid-1945, the U.S. Army was moving more tonnage in a single day than the entire German logistics network had managed in the final month of the war. This was the Materialschlacht, the war of material, and the German civilian realized with a sinking heart that they had been led to fight a war against a literal mountain of steel and calories. At the center of this cultural collision was a recurring sensory shock, the smell of American coffee and the sight of the GI's equipment. Every piece of gear, from the M1 helmet to the sturdy combat boots, was a testament to a factory system that was untouched and thriving. The Germans saw that even the lowest-ranking American private possessed better equipment than a German colonel had in 1944. This was not just military superiority. It was the manifestation of a different ideology, one that prioritized the individual's comfort and survival through the power of industrial production. The German civilian, trapped in the hunger winter that was already casting its shadow, began to look at these healthy conquerors with a mixture of resentment and desperate curiosity. They saw the GIs handing out sticks of Wrigley's gum to children who didn't know what it was, explaining through gestures how to chew but not swallow. In these small exchanges, the myth of the American monster began to fray at the edges. The giants had arrived, and they brought with them a standard of living that made the promises of the Third Reich look like the delusions of a pauper. The silence of the rubble was now broken by the heavy, confident thud of American boots, signaling that the world had truly turned upside down. As the seasons shifted, the warmth of the first post-war summer gave way to the biting uncertainty of autumn, and eventually the hunger winter took hold. This was a period of profound physical and spiritual desperation, where the calories consumed by a German civilian dropped to levels that signaled slow-motion extinction. In the dark, unheated rooms of Frankfurt and Munich, mothers sat in their overcoats, watching the breath of their children turn to frost in the indoor air. The context of this suffering was the total collapse of the German agricultural and distribution systems. There were no trains to bring coal, and no horses left to plow the fields. The German people were experiencing a famine of both the body and the soul, living as ghosts in the shadows of their former lives. The emotional contrast of this period was sharpened by the proximity of the American barracks. While a German family might share a single watery bowl of turnip soup, the air around the American encampments was thick with the scent of frying bacon and hot coffee. This sensory divide created a psychological fracture. The German civilian felt like a specter haunting the feast of the living. Factual records of the era note that the official ration for a German normal consumer frequently dipped below 1,000 calories a day, barely enough to sustain the heart's beat. Meanwhile, the American GI was provided with a daily intake of over 4,000 calories. This was the silver spoon of the American democracy, the immense, almost casual ability to provide for its own, even thousands of miles from its shores. The silver spoon became the recurring symbol of this era, manifesting in the most mundane objects. It was the polished mess kit of the soldier, the sturdy metal spoon that scooped out thick beef stew from a green tin. To the German eye, that spoon represented a world where metallurgy was used for the comfort of the common man rather than the forging of bayonets. It was a tool of life. Historical evidence from the time describes the rubble women who worked to clear the streets, often pausing to watch the Americans eat. They saw the silver flash of those spoons and realized that the American ideology was not built on the glorification of death or sacrifice, but on the celebration of the individual's belly and the child's health. The psychological transformation began when the desperation for food finally overcame the lingering pride of the Reich. German civilians, who had been told that the Americans were their racial inferiors, found themselves standing in lines for Hoover meals, the relief food provided by the American administration. The shame of the breadline was slowly replaced by a dawning realization: the Americans were feeding their enemies. This was a concept entirely foreign to the Nazi mind, which dictated that the weak must perish to make room for the strong. By choosing to sustain the very people who had fought them, the Americans were wielding a weapon more powerful than the atomic bomb. They were attacking the root of the Nazi philosophy with the simple, silver-plated grace of a full ladle. This hunger created a haunting, hollowed-out atmosphere. The sound of the ghost was the scraping of a wooden spoon against a ceramic bowl, trying to find one last morsel of grain. It was the sound of a nation that had been starved by its own leaders, now looking toward the West for its first true taste of mercy. The silver spoon was no longer just an utensil. It was the promise of a different kind of power, one that derived its strength from the ability to feed, to heal, and to restore. The German civilian was beginning to understand that the abundance of the American was not a sign of decadence, but the fruit of a freedom they had never known. The table was being set for a transformation that would be finalized not by the politician, but by the heart. The heavy, rhythmic thud of the boots gave way to a sound that would define the era of occupation: the mechanical roar of the American Jeep. In the devastated urban centers of the Rhineland and the Ruhr, the Jeep became the physical avatar of a new age. It was a vehicle that did not exist in the German civilian's vocabulary of design. The Third Reich had promised its citizens the Volkswagen, the people's car, a rounded, friendly promise of mobility that, in reality, was never delivered to the masses. Instead, the German people had seen their factories diverted to build the Kübelwagen, a harsh, angular machine of war. When the Americans arrived, they did not bring a car for the elite or a crude vehicle for the front. They brought a versatile, rugged machine that seemed to go everywhere and do everything with an almost arrogant ease. The historical context of this mechanical invasion was the sheer industrial disparity between the two nations. While Germany had relied on millions of horses to pull its supply wagons until the final days of the conflict, the Americans were fully motorized. To the German civilian standing on a street corner in 1946, the sight of a 19-year-old American private driving a Jeep was a lesson in sociology. The soldier handled the machine with a casual, one-handed grip, often with a radio playing music from the Armed Forces Network. This was the sound of the Jeep, a mixture of high-octane fuel and the upbeat, brassy swing of Glenn Miller. It was a sound that represented a standard of living that was previously unimaginable to the average European. The Jeep served as a symbol of American social mobility and democracy. Unlike the rigid hierarchy of the Wehrmacht, where vehicles were reserved for officers and specialized units, every American seemed to have access to a motor. This was the mechanical embodiment of the American dream. The German civilian, who had spent the war years under a regime that micromanaged every aspect of their existence, watched as these vehicles zipped through the rubble, carrying mail, medicine, and soldiers on leave. The Jeep was not just a tool of war, it was a tool of freedom. It represented a society that had mastered the assembly line not just for destruction, but for the empowerment of the common individual. Factual records of the early occupation emphasize the psychological impact of American transport. During the early phases of what would become the Berlin airlift, the German populace saw that the Americans could sustain an entire city from the air, but on the ground, it was the jeep and the truck that distributed that life. The German civilian realized that the American abundance was not a fluke, it was a systemic reality. The people's car of the Nazis had been a propaganda mirage, but the soldier's jeep was a tangible, oily, roaring reality. As the sound of the jeep became a constant in the German ear, the perception of the occupier began to shift. The mechanical roar was no longer the sound of an invader, it was the sound of a provider. It was the sound of a world that worked, a world where machines served men rather than men serving the machine of the state. The contrast between the silent, stalled German industry and the vibrant, mobile American presence was a daily reminder of the ideology they had lost and the one they were slowly beginning to adopt. The Jeep was the herald of a new world, paving the way through the ruins for a future that was increasingly defined by the American cadence. In the immediate wake of the surrender, a psychological fortress rose between the victors and the vanquished, the wall of indifference. This was not a physical barrier of stone, but a rigid policy of non-fraternization mandated by the American High Command. The directive was clear. Soldiers were forbidden from speaking to, shaking hands with, or showing any sign of friendship toward the German populace. To the American GI, the German civilian was the enemy, the silent accomplice to a regime that had plunged the world into darkness. To the German, the American was a stony-faced judge, a conqueror who looked through them as if they were part of the very rubble they cleared. The streets of occupied cities like Stuttgart and Frankfurt became theaters of cold, mutual avoidance. The historical context of this period was defined by the discovery of the concentration camps, a revelation that had hardened the hearts of the American military. As photographs of the atrocities appeared in the Stars and Stripes and were posted on town squares, the GI's attitude shifted from cautious curiosity to a wall of moral iron. The emotional contrast was stark. The American soldier, typically known for his gregarious and friendly nature, became a silent sentinel. He stood at his post with his rifle slung, his eyes fixed on the horizon, ignoring the desperate glances of the people passing by. The German civilians, many of whom were struggling with their own shock and burgeoning guilt, found themselves living in a society where they were effectively invisible to those who held the keys to their survival. This wall was reinforced by the disparity in the soundscape of the two worlds. Inside the American compounds, there was the laughter of men playing cards, the clatter of full mess kits, and the upbeat tempo of swing music. Outside the wire, there was only the shuffling of feet in oversized shoes and the low, hushed tones of a defeated people. The symbolic object of the silver spoon remained tucked away in the pockets of the GIs, a tool for their private nourishment that was not yet to be shared. The German civilian felt the weight of this silence as a form of purgatory. They were no longer being bombed, but they were not yet being embraced. They were suspended in an ideological no-man's land where their previous identity had been stripped away, and no new one had been offered. Factual records of 1945 show that the non-fraternization policy was a struggle for both sides. The American soldier, often a young man from a small town in the Midwest, found it difficult to maintain a mask of hatred when faced with the sight of a starving child or an elderly woman struggling with a heavy load of firewood. Conversely, the German civilian, conditioned for years to fear the American beast, was confused by the lack of overt cruelty. There were no mass executions, no forced labor camps in the American zone. There was only the wall, the cold, professional indifference of a democracy that was waiting for the conquered to prove they were human again. This period of forced distance was essential for the transformation that followed. It created a tension that could not hold indefinitely. The German people were forced to sit in the silence of their own making, contemplating the ruins of their ideology while watching the vibrant, self-contained life of the Americans from across the fence. The wall of indifference served as a mirror, reflecting back to the Germans the isolation they had once imposed upon the rest of Europe. It was only through this period of profound, cold separation that the eventual breaking of the mask would carry such explosive emotional weight. The silence was the necessary prelude to the sound that would eventually shatter the last remnants of the old world. The wall of indifference could not withstand the simple, stubborn reality of human nature, and soon the first cracks began to appear in the mask of the occupier. It began not with a formal decree from the high command, but with the small, illicit gestures of the individual soldier. The American GI, despite the stern warnings of his superiors, found it impossible to remain a statue when faced with the hollowed-out eyes of the German youth. The mask slipped in the quiet moments. A chocolate bar passed through a chain-link fence, a stick of gum offered to a child on a street corner, or the sharing of a cigarette with a German laborer during a rest break. These were the unofficial interactions that began to dismantle the architecture of fear that had defined the previous decade. The historical context of this cracking mask was rooted in the fundamental character of the American soldier. Unlike the indoctrinated youth of the Hitler Youth or the iron-disciplined SS, the GI was a civilian in uniform, a product of a society that valued empathy and personal initiative. While the Nazi myth had characterized the American as a vengeful monster, the reality was a young man from Ohio or California who missed his own younger brothers and sisters. Documented accounts from 1946 describe soldiers intentionally losing their rations or leaving crates of oranges near groups of children, then walking away so the civilians could find them without violating the technical rules of non-fraternization. This was the birth of the chocolate pilot spirit, an era where the weapons of war were replaced by the sweets of peace. The emotional contrast of these moments was profound. For the German civilian, the gift of a Hershey bar was more than just a source of calories. It was a sensory explosion that shattered the propaganda of the past. The taste of real sugar and cocoa, luxuries that had vanished from the Reich years prior, represented the tangible superiority of the American system. But more importantly, the act of giving was a moral shock. The Germans had been taught that the weak were to be exploited, yet here was the victor, the giant with a silver spoon, reaching down to feed the child of his enemy. This simple act of kindness did more to de-radicalize the German populace than 1,000 hours of lectures. It proved that the Americans possessed a spiritual abundance that matched their industrial might. Factual records highlight the rapid decay of the non-fraternization policy. Military police reports from the time show a losing battle against fraternization, as GIs began to help German families repair their roofs or share their coal to keep a widow's house warm. The Americans were not acting out of a desire for political conversion. They were simply being themselves. The symbol of the silver spoon was now being extended, dipping into the vast American reserves to offer a taste of life to those who had been surrounded by death. The German civilian began to see the GI not as an occupier, but as a neighbor in uniform, a man who carried the promise of a future that was not based on the crushing weight of the state, but on the simple, shared decencies of the individual. As the mask fell, the atmosphere of the occupied zones underwent a chemical change. The tension of the wall dissolved into a tentative, burgeoning hope. The silence of the rubble was being replaced by the sound of voices in conversation, broken German and slang-heavy English meeting in the middle. The ideology of the master race was finally dying, not because it was defeated in battle, but because it was made irrelevant by the sight of a conqueror who smiled. The cracking of the mask was the first true step toward the emotional breach that would eventually follow, as the German people prepared to see the final and most powerful evidence of the world they had lost and the one they were being invited to join. By late 1946 and into 1947, a new and startling sound began to echo through the ruins of Frankfurt, Wiesbaden, and Munich, the high-pitched melodic laughter of women and the chatter of American English spoken in domestic tones. This was the arrival of the families. Under Operation Daddy, the United States military began the unprecedented task of transporting thousands of wives and children across the Atlantic to join the occupying forces. To the German civilian, who had seen only the olive-drab world of soldiers and the gray world of the displaced, the arrival of American families was a cultural earthquake. It signaled that the Americans were not merely passing through as conquerors, they were building a society, and they were bringing the most precious thing they owned, their own future. The historical context of this influx was a logistical marvel. Entire neighborhoods that had been requisitioned or rebuilt were transformed into Little Americas. While the German populace lived in Kellerwohnungen, basement apartments, cramped and damp, the American families moved into houses with curtains, flower boxes, and the soft glow of electric lights. Factual records from the Department of the Army show that by 1947, over 30,000 dependents had arrived in the U.S. zone. This was a deliberate policy of democratization through example. The military high command believed that the sight of a functioning, healthy American family would do more to stabilize the German psyche than any military parade. They were introducing the concept of a normal life to a nation that had forgotten what normalcy felt like. The emotional contrast was staggering. German mothers, many of whom were Kriegswitwen, war widows, watched from behind their fences as American wives pushed strollers and carried bags of groceries that seemed to overflow with impossible treasures. The symbolic silver spoon had now moved from the soldier's mess kit to the family kitchen. It was the sound of a metal spoon stirring sugar into a tea cup on a sunny porch, a sound that represented a level of security and peace that seemed divine. The Germans saw American teenagers in bobby socks and Letterman sweaters, a vibrant and carefree youth that stood in haunting contrast to the solemn, overworked, and malnourished German children who spent their afternoons scavenging for firewood or scrap metal. The transformation of the barracks into domestic hubs changed the very vibration of the occupied zones. The smell of the occupation shifted from diesel and cosmoline to the scent of laundry soap and apple pie. For the German civilian, this was the ultimate proof of American power. It was not the power of the tank, but the power of the home. They realized that while the Nazi regime had demanded the sacrifice of the family for the state, the American state existed to protect and provide for the family. The American woman, with her bright clothes and confident stride, became a figure of intense fascination and quiet emulation for German women who had been told their only role was Kinder, Kusch, Kirche, under a regime that eventually sent their sons to die in the snows of Russia. This period marked the end of the soldier-only occupation and the beginning of a living exhibition of Western democracy. The American family was a walking advertisement for the benefits of a free society. As the German people watched these families interact, fathers playing catch with sons, mothers reading to daughters in the parks, the psychological distance began to shrink. They weren't just looking at occupiers, they were looking at a version of themselves that might have been, and perhaps could be again. The arrival of the families set the stage for the final emotional breach, as the most innocent sound of all, the sound of children at play, prepared to deliver the most devastating blow to the remnants of the old ideology. The visual landscape of the American occupation had reached its final stage of evolution. In the housing areas of Wiesbaden and the suburbs of Berlin, the chain-link fences that separated the American compounds from the German streets became a strange, quiet frontier. On one side lay the Little Americas, with their paved sidewalks, manicured lawns, and the bright, primary colors of toys scattered in driveways. On the other side stood the German civilians, a people still draped in the drab grays and blacks of mourning, their silhouettes thin against the backdrop of skeletal buildings. They would gather at these fences, often standing in silence for hours, peering through the wire like survivors looking into a dream. The historical context of this fence-watching was a profound communal longing. The German populace was not looking for a handout, they were looking for a sign of life. After a decade of the goose step, the barked command, and the siren's wail, their ears were attuned to the sounds of a militarized existence. But from across the fence came a sound that was entirely alien to the atmosphere of post-war Germany, the uninhibited, chaotic, and joyous noise of children at play. These were the sons and daughters of the American officers and NCOs, children who had never known a night in a bomb shelter or the taste of sawdust bread. They ran across the grass with a frantic, healthy energy, their voices rising in games of tag and hide and seek. The emotional contrast was a physical ache. The German children standing on the outside were often silent, their play inhibited by the trauma of the war and the exhaustion of malnutrition. They watched the American children, dressed in clean cotton, their faces round and rosy, as if they were creatures from another planet. The symbolic silver spoon had manifested now as the American child's bicycle, the leather baseball glove, and the bright red wagon. These were objects of play, not of survival. To the German adult, the sight was a devastating indictment of the path they had followed. They realized that while they had been promised a glorious future of conquest, the Americans had simply built a world where a child could be a child. The sound from the fence, the shrill whistles, the laughter, and the occasional cry over a scraped knee, carried a frequency that penetrated the last defenses of the German heart. It was the sound of a generation that was not being prepared for the front lines. In the Third Reich, the Hitler Youth had turned play into drill, and laughter into a rhythmic chant. But the American laughter was disorganized, irreverent, and free. It was the sound of democracy in its most primal form. The German civilians realized that this abundance of spirit was the direct result of the abundance of the silver spoon. The calories and the freedom had produced a youth that was fearless because it had never been hunted. Factual records of the period describe the German Zuschauer, the onlookers, as being mesmerized by the lack of discipline in American play. They saw fathers coming home from duty, throwing their caps onto chairs and lifting their daughters into the air. This display of domestic affection, performed in the open and without fear of the state, was a revolutionary concept. The fence was no longer a barrier of non-fraternization. It was a window into a different way of being human. As the sound of the American children grew louder in the ears of the defeated, the emotional dam began to crack. The realization was dawning that the enemy possessed something far more powerful than the V-2 rocket. They possessed a happy childhood. The stage was now set for the moment the dam would finally break, and the tears would flow. The emotional dam that had held back the collective grief of a nation finally shattered not in the face of a speech or a monument, but at the sound of a simple, high-pitched peal of laughter. It happened in the quiet afternoons outside the housing compounds, where German men and women, veterans of the Eastern Front, widows of the air raids, and survivors of the firestorms, stood motionless by the wire. As the American children chased each other through the sprinklers, their shouts of joy cutting through the heavy, humid air of the German summer, the civilians began to weep. These were not the tears of the defeated or the self-pitying. They were the tears of a people realizing the sheer scale of what they had allowed to be stolen from their own lives and the lives of their children. The historical context of this great crying was a profound psychological realization. For 12 years, the German soul had been funneled into a narrow, cold channel of duty and death. The laughter of the American children was a sensory proof that the Nazi ideology had been a monstrous lie. The decadent West had produced a generation of vibrant, happy youth, while the master race had produced a generation of traumatized orphans and broken soldiers. Factual records of the era, preserved in personal diaries and the reports of social workers, describe a phenomenon of sudden, inexplicable weeping among the German populace when witnessing American domestic life. The laughter was the final blow to the Nazi myth. It was the sound of a future that Germany had traded away for a handful of ash. The emotional contrast was a visceral shock. To the German ear, the laughter felt like a physical weight. It was the sound of abundance, not just of food, but of safety. The symbolic silver spoon had reached its ultimate purpose. It had nurtured a childhood that was allowed to be loud, messy, and free. The German civilians realized that the giant across the fence was not their enemy because of his tanks, but because of his peace. They saw that the American ideology did not require the sacrifice of the individual for the glory of the state. Instead, the state existed to ensure that a child could laugh without fear. This was the true weapon of the United States, an emotional and spiritual resilience born of freedom. The transformation was absolute. In those moments of weeping, the last remnants of the old regime's grip were washed away. The sound of the children at play acted as a catalyst for a new German identity, one that would eventually prioritize the reconstruction of a civil society over the pursuit of military glory. The German civilian, once a cog in a machine of conquest, was being reborn through the pain of this realization. They were learning that the highest achievement of a civilization was not the conquering of a neighbor, but the nurturing of a home. The sound from the fence had breached the emotional walls of the Reich, proving that a society's strength is measured by the laughter of its most vulnerable members. This was the emotional breach, the point of no return. The crying was a purge, a communal admission of the darkness they had inhabited. As the tears fell into the dust of the ruins, the German people were finally ready to listen to the larger truth about the freedom they had been shown. The laughter of the American children had become the soundtrack of their liberation, a melodic bridge leading them out of the nightmare of the past and toward a world where the silver spoon was not a luxury for the few, but a promise for the many. The breach was open, and the light of a new world was pouring in. The transformation of the German landscape was now complete, moving from the hollow, terrifying silence of 1945 to a symphony of reconstruction and domestic vitality. The rubble that once defined the horizon had been cleared, not just by shovels and bulldozers, but by the psychological shift that occurs when a nation decides to live again. The silver spoon had served its historical purpose. It had begun as a soldier's tool for survival, evolved into a mother's implement for relief, and finally became the domestic anchor of a newly stabilizing society. It remained the recurring symbol of American democracy, an abundance that was not hoarded but used to rebuild the very world that had sought to destroy it. This was the ultimate victory of the American ideology, the conversion of a battlefield into a neighborhood. The historical truth revealed in the tears of the German civilians was a profound lesson in the nature of power. True power did not reside in the iron-fisted control of the state or the expansion of borders through violence. Instead, it was found in the quiet security of the individual and the uninhibited joy of the next generation. The German people, standing at the fences of those American housing areas, had witnessed a living exhibition of a larger truth. They saw that a society built on freedom, represented by the casual confidence of the GI and the exuberant laughter of his children, possessed a durability that tyranny could never replicate. The American abundance was not a sign of decadence. It was the surplus of a free people who had mastered their own destiny. The poetic reflection of this era is found in the transition from the sound of the siren to the sound of the playground. The laughter of the American children had acted as a spiritual tuning fork, realigning the German ear to a frequency of peace. It was a sound that proved that the darkness of the Third Reich was not an inevitable human condition, but a detour that could be corrected. The tears shed by that generation of Germans were the first rains of a long-delayed spring. They were an admission that the pursuit of the master race was a hollow pursuit of death, while the pursuit of a happy, well-fed childhood was the only conquest that truly mattered. As the occupation eventually transitioned into a partnership, the memory of that emotional breach remained as the foundation of a new, democratic Germany. The lesson of the silver spoon, that a nation is defined by what it provides, not what it takes, became the cornerstone of a reconstructed Europe. The history of the 20th century is often written in the blood of soldiers and the ink of treaties, but the truth of the human experience is often found in the sensory details. The smell of fresh citrus in a ruined street, the silver flash of a mess kit, and the piercing, beautiful sound of a child who has no reason to be afraid. In the end, the story of the American occupation of Germany is the story of an abundance that was shared until it became a common inheritance. It is a testament to the fact that democracy's greatest weapon is the quality of life it offers. The German civilians who cried at the sound of American laughter were not mourning a lost war. They were celebrating the discovery of a world where life was allowed to be abundant, where childhood was sacred, and where the sound of joy was the loudest voice in the land. The echoes of that laughter remain a haunting, beautiful reminder that freedom is not just an idea, but a way of being that can change the heart of the world, one silver spoon at a time.